Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation to address you on the topic of innovation and governance. After this upbeat presentation, I'm afraid I'm going to spoil the pleasure. When you look at the quadruple helix, there is indeed governance. But I'd like to ask the question, have we properly analyzed the role of governance? What do we mean by it? And how does it function in the innovation value chain? Indeed, does it function in an innovation value chain? Or is it an obstacle? We've had 2 lost decades in Europe for innovation, which is proven by our declining competitiveness. It's not research and development capacities which are lacking, and it's not funding which is lacking. It's not interest of citizens either. So why is it that we've had 2 lost decades? Why is it that in this interesting introductory presentation, Martin only refers to local governments who are innovative and takes examples from local governments? These questions, ladies and gentlemen, were at the background of the creation of the high-level group on innovation policy management. And Richard also pointed out the importance of management in private or management in public sector, which is just a different word for governance. You see, I warned you, it was provocative, and already the red light is flashing all the time. Shall I stop? We focus, the high-level group was an initiative of the Competitiveness Council presidency under Poland 2 years ago, and I have the honor to coach it. And we focus on what are the framework conditions to facilitate innovation in Europe. What is the ecosystem which we lead, not single, but ecosystems, plural, at European level, at national level, at local level, in governments and in business, and how can they interact? And also, how can we measure output? Because I'm afraid we take the view that the EU has become too much focused on inputs, but not on outputs. No, sorry, how does this work? There it is. It's very innovative. You have to push the backward button to go forward. Let me look at the functions of government. The very first function of government is and has always been capital allocation. Yet today, capital allocation clearly favors traditional sectors, not to mention transactional capital in the financial services sector. So there's enough money around in Europe, it's just in the wrong places from a point of view of innovation. A second function of government is, of course, always been security for citizens and economic actors. Third function has been regulation and discipline. Now, it is true that parts of the European system are innovative-oriented. But what about the other parts, which equally happily create the obstacles for the innovation, which the other part is trying to promote? This is not an individual failure. These are system failures which we experience today in the European Union. System failures which depend on the method of governance, on structures and procedures from the age of the typewriter. And I mean what I say, because the European Union and its basic structure and procedures were established in the 1950s and have never fundamentally adapted since. They're really out of synchronization. with the needs of a modern economy and a modern society. We need, ladies and gentlemen, creative destruction of institutions, not just in the economic sector. Let us take a look backwards. Where does our present political order comes from? It was established in parallel with the printing press. The modern political order, the modern state as we know it, dates from the Westphalian Peace Conference, which followed the technology innovation of the printing press. It was the printing press which allowed the development of the modern bureaucracy and organization and procedures. It was that organization which created the framework conditions for the industrial economy and for new inventions such as the steam engine to be organized into economic added value. That basic governance concept we still operate with at the time of innovation, at a time when these exciting new technology developments enter our world. And they do not enter, they have entered our world. Our economies have changed and continue to change all the time, and citizens' attitudes change with it. There are various interpretations of the outcomes of the European elections, but it depends on the perspective which you take. So what we need are radical shifts in governance, organization, and methodology. System changes, that's what we need. And we are far from it. We lost 2 decades of competitiveness in Europe, and we lost them because our attention was not focused on the 4th dimension of the quadruple helix. Our attention was focused on the infamous Lisbon Treaty, which was really nothing else than a reshift of power between European Union institutions and between member states, but not an innovation of governance. And that's the reason, in my view, why the European Union, which once was a force for competitiveness, establishing a common market, establishing a single market, establishing the Eurozone, is now actually an obstacle. The system is an obstacle. Despite all the inputs which are given, the fragmentations which in the system lead to very little output. The money spent is impressive, but first of all, it's spent on research, and as we all know, research does not necessarily lead to innovation in markets. Secondly, it's divided over so many sectors and 28 member states, which each want their piece of the cake, that in the end it is meaningless. Governments and public institutions are to blame for this, not the system is at fault, not people. The quality that we have still some progress is due, in fact, to the quality of people operating it. Let me address 2 issues, which in my view are essential for governance innovation, and then I'll speak a little bit what this means, or could mean, governance innovation, because nobody has the answer really, not yet. First of all is ecological complexity. Let us look at Europe's environmental policy. No one will doubt that we need a more sustainable environment, a more sustainable social society. Sustainability is not in the question. There are various forms of sustainability, of course. There's sustainability in environment, there's also sustainable competitiveness, there's sustainable employment. One cannot dissociate them. But in fragmented policy systems, they are dissociated and then become obstacles for one another. That is what is happening at the moment in Europe. But let's return to the environment policy as just one example of how we have gotten gone backward. Once we were a front runner in Europe, in the world. And still today, on ecological sustainability, Europe is leading conceptually. Yet, it's creating an obstacle in innovation because of the basic paradigm underlying it. Europe follows to achieve sustainability a linear concept, a linear regulatory concept. It's very unfortunate that Europe is dominated by lawyers. I'm one of them, but I've left. Lawyers think in linear ways. They don't think in system ways. And in the 1970s, that was fine. You could start managing the first environmental problems. You remember acid rain, those are old enough, by this approach. The more you penetrate into environmental management, the more you need a systems approach, which is lacking. Now, climate research in particular, and thanks to ICT, which allows now new forms of massive data management, has focused on ecological systems and on their interdependence. Now, if you focus on ecological systems and their interdependence, you enter a totally new paradigm. Look at the Norwegian government. They have two objectives. They want to protect the ice bear, and they want to exploit the oil and gas. And the Minister of Industry told me, in between these two objectives is the space for research and innovation. The Brussels environmental reaction is ban the oil and gas exploitation to protect the ice bear. Driven by an outdated, unscientific risk concept. So we need there really a massive change. The other challenge is what I call ensuring social stability, because there aren't really 20% people who voted for populist parties. Yes, there are. But there's 60% others of European citizens who even didn't bother to vote. That's a dramatic figure. And the problem is, because we have again a failure of what I call managing complexity. The EU is not to blame for it. It's a very successful transnational organization, but it hasn't focused on the governance of its own successes, on the integration it has achieved. We now have a real fault line between macroeconomic policy managed in Brussels and welfare state mechanisms managed by member states. In a certain sense, the two have become dissociated. You can manage the economy in an abstract way without caring about welfare. And this is the true nature of the unaccountability of the European Union. It is that it's lost the systemic connection to the interest of citizens, which is what should matter first. Of course, one talks about it, but the system doesn't integrate as it should the welfare, competitiveness, employment conditions into the economic policy making. So this is a systemic problem, also one which really can only be solved by new forms of governance, just as in the environmental field. And then I really put my last hope not on any other science than on ICT. Only ICT allows to manage the complexity of modern government systems, the interdependencies between ecological, economic, or social sustainability, between the different levels of government. It's a problem also well known in the US, but because the US is a far more integrated political system, whereas Europe consists of 28 different polities. We advance much more slowly in integrating ICT into governance. We need to overcome these multiple fault lines within the Commission, between the European institutions, between the 28 governments, and between all the other stakeholders in the quadruple helix. Because one cannot imagine a government, a state, like something like a billiard ball, and there are 28 rolling on the billiard table in Brussels. A state is itself a complex setting together. And government power has been evaporating as a result of ICT. Because we are now more connected with citizens around a given issue of other countries, Europe-wide and globally, than we are with our own citizens or government on another issue. So business is a similar example. Even a small startup company, and that's the only SMEs which matter in fact, because 99% of SMEs are in the plumbing sector and in the services sector. Only a small percentage is truly innovative startups. But those who are, think of course immediately in Europe and global market terms. So, but national policy making is still dominated by national paradigms, by short-term electoral cycles. That's why we are fortunate to have, after all, the European Commission. At least we have one governing body which has a 5-year horizon, which doesn't have to worry about the next election, like you have in the European Council, where every time there is an election which holds back decision-making somewhere. So we need to move now to different forms of governance, but we need to move to open governments. Open innovation requires, ladies and gentlemen, open governments. You can't have the one without the other. And that means that governance systems at European and national level need to change from their linear, legalistic, regulatory-driven approaches to an open, collaborative management approach. This brings new forms of alignment, because if we have so many political problems in the European Union, it is because we have failed to align business and governments. We were aligned for 20, 30 years, because the big alignment, the putting the man on the moon vision, was to stabilize peace and economic cooperation. We got it, we achieved it. And what's next? We don't know. It hasn't been decided. It hasn't been brought about. So we need a new process of alignment. We need a new vision in European Union. And open innovation clearly is the method to develop it. Innovating economies, innovating environment policy, innovating sustainability, bringing back employment. They hang together, so we need a more inclusive approach than the fragmented approach of the old government systems inherited from the industrial age, modernized in the 1950s and no longer modernized afterwards. And on that basis, we need to move to forms of collaborative governments. There are enough experimental forms of collaborative governments, and indeed in bits and parcels of the European Union or member states it is applied already. But we need to change it from an experimental in the margin system of governments to a systemic way of doing things. Open innovation requires open governments. It requires, of course, institutional change, which is never easy. Also not in business. It requires procedural change, but the start of it, ladies and gentlemen, is a cultural change. And there I believe Open Innovation Platform can play really a list. So, Messieurs co-chairman, I've come with a to-do list for you. I really think that you who are involved in open innovation, your social responsibility extends beyond the strict confines of economic innovation. You cannot avoid to address the question of how technology and values, how technology and national and European identities fit together. What is the social impact? In one of the leading Dutch nanotechnology research institutes, every researcher now has to accompany his research with a social impact assessment study. I think that's an excellent idea. We need to change, with the input of ICT, key policy areas like ecological sustainability, climate change and everything related to it. And we need to move to a new form of governance where we apply the open innovation concepts in general to that one slide of it, which is governance. Which means, how do we look at the different integration and collaboration of the different levels, local, regional, national, European, even global, and the different actors. We can no longer leave this to governments because our actors, businesses and citizens, have already moved to the European level and the global level. The example of crowdfunding is global. So we can take part in it just like anyone else. So where are we with our industrial economy type of funding systems if you have already operating new systems? So we need a fundamental change of thinking about the governing of the framework conditions for innovation. And this is the challenge, Messieurs co-chairman, I leave to you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.